almost 30 years, Rockstar has dominated the games industry with their Grand Theft Auto series. Games built on chaos, crime, and the systems that are working against them. And while GTA is known for being loud and unapologetic, there's one thing about the series that rarely gets talked about: its depiction of minority characters. I recently got a comment asking me to talk about the Black representation that we've seen so far in GTA 6 and the impact that it could have on the Black community. This is a great discussion, not just for us, but for everyone, because this game is hands down going to be one of the biggest releases ever. Rockstar Games is the trendsetter, the blueprint, and are literally holding a time bomb in their hands with GTA 6. If they get Black representation wrong, that impact is going to be massive. The confirmed Black characters so far are Booby Ike, a real estate mogul and record label owner, Draquan Priest, a former drug dealer, now recording artist, and Lux and Roxy, longtime friends who chase trends with their spicy rap tracks. But to better understand where we're going, we have to look at where we've been. I've already covered CJ and Franklin, two of the most iconic Black male video game characters in history, and why I personally believe that they are great examples of representation despite the amount of criticism that they get. If you haven't seen those videos, I highly recommend checking them out after this one. Today, I want to take on that criticism of CJ and Franklin head on, break them down, and see what they might tell us about the 4 new Black characters in GTA 6. While doing research for this video, I stumbled across this article, Grand Theft Auto Depictions of Minorities, that was pretty critical, and it almost made me angry in the ways in which it got so many of the details wrong and bypassed the real-life systemic barriers that plague Black people today. To be clear, I'm not attacking this person directly, but I have seen similar rhetoric being discussed about these 2 characters, and I largely disagree with it, so let's get into it. The first point they made was that out of 27 main protagonists within the series' lifespan, only 11 of them are minorities, 5 being Black, 4 Latinx, and 2 Asian. While they do point out how much more this is compared to the rest of the games industry, which is true, they essentially believe that the franchise should have had more minority characters. We need to stop and think critically about what the GTA franchise actually is. GTA is about drugs, performing heists, deleting people, and almost every crime underneath the sun. Wouldn't the optics be absolutely horrible if they only really focused on minority people? I feel like at that point we would be side-eyeing them and asking them what their obsession with minorities committing crime is. A franchise about criminals is far from the first place that we should be asking for more representation. But one thing more important than Black representation quantity is quality. And this article states that Rockstar's depiction of minorities is shallow, stereotypical, and exploitative in nature. That characters like CJ and Franklin are gangbangers in the ghetto, as opposed to the mob/mafia white-collar criminals. When people talk about crime in the Black community, they often point to street violence or gang association, but what they ignore is that crime isn't just about behavior, it's also about access. White-collar crimes such as fraud, embezzlement, and corporate exploitation require access to resources like education and wealth, which have been systemically withheld from Black Americans. I would argue that it is more important to tell accurate stories about where crime in the Black community stems from, because many did come from broken homes, did lose loved ones too soon to overdoses, and did have to join gangs in order to protect their families. Of course, not every Black person is from the ghetto or poor or uneducated, but to ignore systemic barriers is not protection, it's erasure. In a way, this article does the same thing that politicians, officials, and voices of power do: tell poor Black men that their lives and the things they go through don't matter. I'm convinced this writer has not actually played the game, or at the least missed the message baked into it, because they describe CJ as a stereotypical power-hungry thug. CJ is from an extremely poor neighborhood in Los Santos. Gang association was most likely the best way for him and his family to protect themselves. Not only that, but the story takes place in the thick of the crack epidemic. Drugs had infected the city, and Grove Street was the only gang that wasn't dealing because they didn't want to perpetuate harm and damage done in their communities. The flashy, violent, aggressive way that we see gangs today is not actually where the movement started. When poor black men and women were being targeted by white civilians and police officers, they banded together in order to protect themselves. They would go on to give back to their communities, feed the homeless, and even make after-school programs. The system had failed them. They knew that no one was coming to save them, and so they worked to save themselves. And it worked. Gang members were looked to as leaders and protectors until they weren't.
Certain history, like why certain gangs in certain neighborhoods even started, they were like community organizations. It was like a development strategy to help feed the people, build parks, after school programs. A true story, what happened in my community, there are certain law enforcement who would come into the neighborhood and destroy the playgrounds that the Crips would build and disrupt the food program and say that the Bloods did it. And then they would do vice versa. And that's kind of in a specific neighborhood how like feuding started.
I don't find coincidence in the fact that cheap, highly addictive drugs started making their way into inner city neighborhoods once gangs started to prove productive to black communities. And if you're a critical thinker, you shouldn't either.
Some of the people who have taken this crack said it is a greater experience than a sex. That's what they equated with. For $5.
Crack is not a joke. The withdrawal is one of the worst out of any substance, and if you have never seen someone, let alone someone you love, suffer with addiction, you should consider yourself lucky. There are many reasons why gangs devolved into what we know them as today, but one factor that cannot be ignored is the amount of damage that this drug caused. Even if the introduction of drugs was not deliberate, the fact that no major steps were taken to help these addicts and they were instead just thrown into jail paints a pretty damning picture. If this sounds like a reach to you, it's really not. We've seen the pattern of white supremacist systems stepping into already existing organizations and leaving lasting damage behind time and time again. I watched this movie in high school called Hotel Rwanda. It centers the genocide that took place in Rwanda. The two social groups, Hutus and Tutsis, had already been established, but they relied on their occupation and socioeconomic status to distinguish them. In fact, Rwandans could change from one to the other depending on their financial status. But Belgian and German colonizers invaded and categorized the Tutsis as more valuable because they were lighter skinned with smaller noses. Colonizers even forced every Rwandan citizen to show either Hutu or Tutsi on their licenses, and they couldn't switch groups anymore because it now relied on their physical appearance. Hutu extremists who had been fed up with being treated as less than, went on to slaughter over 1 million Tutsis in only 100 days. What's so mind-boggling about this entire thing is that it would have been entirely avoided had they not been corrupted by more powerful outside forces. Hutus and Tutsis had a system before that wasn't perfect but functioned. It was only when they were deliberately pitted against each other by Europeans that it all fell apart. I'm not in a gang myself, so I could be off with the information here, but I have a hard time believing that gangs would be what we know them as today if they hadn't been corrupted and left to serve their original purpose. The point is, in the criminal world, CJ and the Grove Street families were best case scenario. They weren't power hungry, but desperate to take power away from drug pushers and corrupt police, because they knew that the power was better off in their hands, since they actually cared about the well-being of not just their own family, but the entire city of Los Santos. No, CJ's story isn't the full Black experience, however, he is a facet of the Black experience. Game studios are overwhelmingly not Black, so it is true when they say that a lot of non-Black people worked on the GTA series. But in the case of San Andreas, it was co-written and produced by artist and former gang member DJ Pooh. And what someone might call stereotypical in the way that they carry themselves or the way that they speak is actually a mirror into what real life was at the time. There's this unspoken expectation for Black characters to be the one that defy the odds and succeed in spite of their barriers. This turns into Black stories not being an accurate reflection of the average person succumbing to the system fighting against them, but an idolization of the extraordinary people who managed to overcome it. Anything less than exceptional is now failure. And if only those exceptional people are worthy of having their stories told, it doesn't create any room to fully understand the damages that things like poverty, mental illness, and oppression can cause. Instead of being angry at the crack that was introduced into their neighborhoods, their underfunded schools, and their lack of resources like food, you'd rather turn aim at the people it directly affects. CJ and Franklin were not extraordinary in a conventional way. They didn't follow the correct path, but they are, however, excellent examples of men who operated the criminal world in the best way they knew how. They didn't become senseless monsters or lay down to rest on their laurels. Franklin did just enough to get himself out of poverty, and CJ only wanted as much power that would keep his family safe. To paint them in black or white circumstances with no gray or nuance is ironically the same thought process that leads to discrimination in our court systems, job markets, and general society. It is my assumption that this writer would rather only the stories of good black people be shown in the media. That all black people have to do is be squeaky clean model citizens and their lives would be better. Unfortunately, this assumption is not only common but grossly incorrect. Black men raised in the top 1% by millionaires are as likely to be arrested as white men who grew up in households earning $36,000. The dismissive conclusion is just for black men to not commit crimes, but it doesn't leave any margins for error. One bad judgment call, one mistake will put you behind bars just because of the color of your skin. I'm all for holding people accountable, but it's hard to ignore when that accountability is grossly imbalanced. And if numbers like this exist for the wealthy, then what do you think the statistics look like for the poor? Grand Theft Auto forces you to look at the humanity of CJ and Franklin. No, it's not okay to commit crime, obviously, but their stories ask you to take a closer look at how they ended up this way, and guide you through the nuances of their redeeming qualities. CJ loves his sister and wants what's best for her. He also hates the damaging effects that heavy drugs cause. Franklin is the voice of reason between Trevor and Michael. He's willing to learn while also standing strong in his moral convictions. He dreamt of a life without survival mode, without being surrounded by people who were happy in the ghetto. They both wanted better for themselves. And as grim as this sounds, not every person in their situation does. Some poor black men have been conditioned that they can't or don't deserve better, that their way of life is the only option for them. CJ and Franklin show that black men are more than their circumstances. There's also a small but potent line about Lamar, Franklin's best friend. Franklin, this generation's black character, smokes marijuana all day and is constantly referred to as the N-word by his best friend Lamar. I've mentioned this in a previous video before. I am very quick to dismiss any criticism of Lamar because I think he serves a very powerful and specific purpose. Lamar is an exaggeration of the caricature of a black gangbanger. He's not just the comedic relief, he takes the brunt of the black stereotypes so Franklin can exist outside of them. I think Rockstar knew they couldn't make Franklin as stoic as he is without the existence of Lamar. I believe more than anything that the writer of this article has frustrations that stem beyond GTA. Just like me and many other black gamers, we are incredibly disappointed at the lack of representation in video games. It's natural to look at one of the only studios who are offering representation and ask them why they can't do more or why characters have to fit into a certain archetype. But Grand Theft Auto is a game about committing crimes, and I commend Rockstar for going down a more realistic route and showing real-life reflections of some black men instead of making it strictly fantasy. Instead of questioning Rockstar's choices for their black characters, I think we should be asking the rest of the industry why they haven't bothered to include us. So with Rockstar's overall positive representation of black men in their franchise, what does this mean for the future? Booby Ike's description reads, "Booby is a local Vice City legend and acts like it. One of the few to transform his time in the streets into a legitimate empire spanning real estate, strip club, and a recording studio, Bobby's all smiles until it's time to talk business. The club money pay for the studio, and the drug money pay for it all." Booby's backstory sounds a little bit like Franklin in the way that he wants to turn his life of hustling into something greater. However, I am curious to see about how he differs. He doesn't seem to mind who he hurts or who he has to knock down on the way to his financial goals. He's probably hopeful that his recording studio will be what will keep his empire growing and expanding so he doesn't have to deal with the drugs anymore. But I also get the vibe that he's okay with continuing down that path if he really needs to. He very much gives me the air of, you can stay around me as long as you're useful, and I really don't want to find out what happens if you're not useful. If Franklin represents escape, Booby might represent adaptation, someone who doesn't leave the system but finds a way to control it. I am hopeful that he will be given enough depth to understand why he is the way he is. When we look at characters like Big Bear from San Andreas, we know that he is an addict because of the loss of his childhood friend. It was grief that drove him into the dire circumstance we found him in. So perhaps there's a valid reason for the way Booby moves. He wants better for himself and has found this to be the best way for him to go about it. This is all speculation though. I could see it going either way. He seems more like a vigilante than good or evil in my eyes. Draquan Priest's description says, Draquan was always more of a hustler than a gangster. Even when he was dealing on the streets to make ends meet, breaking into music was the goal. At the end, it says, now that he's signed The Real Demise, Draquan's days of booking acts in Booby's strip club might be numbered as he sets his sights on the Vice City scene. Draquan feels like a different character entirely. Where Booby has leaned into the system, Draquan is actively trying to escape it. He seems pretty confident in his musical abilities, and whether or not that's earned, we're just gonna have to see. I do love that we can see his hunger for a music career. He represents a more modern path where success isn't just survival, but visibility and influence. Real Demise, is it Real Demise? Oh man, I'm gonna look it up. I'm so dumb. Their name is Real Dimes. It's real. How did I get Demise? Real Dimes is the rap group with Baylux and Roxy. Their description says, they have been friends since high school. Girls with the savvy to turn their time shaking down local dealers into cold, hard cash via spicy rap tracks and a relentless social media presence. Real Dimes might be the most culturally relevant depiction that we have seen in GTA so far. Black men are rarely given a seat at the table, which unfortunately means that for Black women it's almost non-existent. So I'm really happy to see that there's not only one but two Black female characters introduced into the series. When I see these two, I immediately think like Sexy Red, Lotto, Megan Thee Stallion kind of energy. They seem really bold and confident and not afraid to take up space, which I really love. However, I do hope that they're also mindful with their depictions, because the same traits that Black women are praised for, being bold, being authentic and confident, are also the things that we get demonized for. So the question isn't really whether they're loud, bold, and fearless, it's whether or not they get to exist outside of that. They run the risk of making these two too flat if they only focus on their rap personas and not the artist behind the artistry. Even if they're only small supporting characters, one or two scenes that showcase their humanity will make all the difference. What's interesting is that none of these characters seem one-dimensional. They are all born within a system that they are trying to navigate, whether that's controlling it, escaping it, or shaping it to suit them. Will they all succeed together? Will one betray the other in order to get ahead? There's objectively more source material to weave a story with based on their descriptions alone, and we might be looking at one of the most nuanced portrayals of Black characters the series has ever had. So when we step back and take a look at all of this, CJ and Franklin, and now these four new Black characters, we start to see a pattern. These aren't just characters who exist to be good or bad or to check boxes of representation. They're characters shaped by the environments they exist in and the systems they're forced to navigate. CJ wasn't a power-hungry thug. He was a man trying to protect what was left of his community in a world that had already failed it. Franklin wasn't just a hustler. He was someone trying to escape a cycle that most people in his position never get out of. And now, with GTA 6, we're seeing a new generation of characters who each seem to represent a different response to the same question. Do you escape the system? Do you learn to work with it? Or do you reshape it entirely? Representation isn't just about whether characters are included, it's about whether they're allowed to feel real. And if Rockstar gets that right with GTA 6, we might be looking at a reflection of how people actually survive, adapt, and dream within systems that were never designed with them in mind. I'm optimistic that Booby, Draquan, Baylux, and Roxy will follow the legacy of Black GTA characters before them by showing the next generation of Black people that they are more than their circumstances. Are you guys excited for GTA 6? Do you actually think it'll come out in November this year like they say? I don't know, I've heard some rumors that they're delaying it again, so I guess we'll just have to see. Subscribe to my Patreon if you would like to see more content from me. I'm currently working on a piece about this problematic scene that I saw on the Dr. Daff show here on YouTube. Thank you so much for watching, I hope you enjoyed it, and I will see you in the next one. Bye.